You're listening to the Ground Transportation Podcast with Ken Lucci of Driving Transactions and James Blain of PAX Training. Learn how you can build a thriving transportation business with real profits, repeat clients, and enterprise value. And now for your hosts, Ken and James.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ground Transportation Podcast. I am really excited today. We are actually doing a special one-on-one episode with Tom Halsnik from Walsh Chauffeured Transportation. In addition to being an incredible operator, a member of the membership committee for the NLA, and the Florida Limousine Association secretary, Tom's actually a really great friend of mine. So I am very excited to have him on the show. I'm very excited to kind of talk about his background and help you guys learn a little bit more about him. Tom, to kind of launch us out here, can you tell us a little bit about how you got in the industry, kind of how you got to where you are?
Sure, I'd be happy to. But first, let me thank you for inviting me to be here. I really do appreciate it. We always have great conversations, so it's nice to be able to do it and have it recorded for posterity's sake. But yeah, I started, believe it or not, back in 1991. Had a friend's mother who worked for an accountant. And he had a client who had lost his driver's license because of too many DUIs.
Oh, jeez.
Which back in the early 90s was saying something because, you know, it wasn't as penalized as it is now. So I was in college at the time and they said, hey, you need somebody to drive him around, take him to his attorney's office, take him to lunch, pay you, you know. I'm like, oh, cool. I get to drive a limo. That's a lot of fun. I'll do that. So that's how it started. And then he bought another limo and he says, hey, maybe we could, rent these out and, you can make a little money. I'll make some money on the cars and stuff. I'm like, okay, sure. Okay. Sounds good to me. So instead of setting up an actual company, we just basically took the overflow from other companies. We said, hey, we're here. If you have anything you don't want or you get overbooked, give it to us.
Affiliate game.
Exactly. So I was affiliate stuff right from the beginning. And that's what we did, I took people out. And because we were like a 2-car operator, basically, we had no like base radio phone or anything. I had a Motorola brick phone that was the owner's, and he would like, okay, it's $3 a minute. Unless somebody is bleeding, don't use it.
So did you get to skip the pager phase, or did you have the pager too?
No, I had the pager too, but that came later on.
Okay.
That came later on. We had this. I mean, basically, when you went off, you had your phone for emergency, but you were on your own. There was no communication, right? So, and people paid in cash back then,
Right.
So it was great. So I'd come back, he'd get his cut, I'd get my cut. It was great. Plus, he'd pay me for the week. Probably the money I made took care of my pay and maybe a little bit more for him, but he didn't really care. He was kind of a trust fund baby.
Okay.
So. Which is how he got into trouble with alcohol and stuff, because he had no job and plenty of money. So that was his thing.
So is that where the Walsh comes from, and Walsh Chauffeured Transportation?
No, it's not actually. So that was in Orlando, because I grew up in Orlando.
Okay.
Moved to Tampa in 93, went to University of South Florida, which is located here in Tampa, and didn't really get into limos until about 95. When I started with a company here in Tampa called Julie's Limousine, which was one of the more popular ones because Julie was on the radio with Ron and Ron radio show, and they did a ton of work and they were pretty well known. And so over the years, I kind of rose up the ranks, and after not long, probably 4 or 5 years, I was one of their top chauffeurs. I would, train people, and she would give me all the celebrity work, all the difficult clients, and that's kind of really where I started, because if you know me, my demeanor is pretty calm.
Yeah.
It's not a whole lot that gets me going or flaps me or anything like that. So I would get the clients that nobody else liked. So, and I did great with them because I kind of figured out when to talk, when not to talk. Oh. You were like just straight professional, and and it was funny because over time, and it became a challenge for me, is to turn those difficult clients into really good clients that, they were difficult with other drivers. They never tipped, and I would turn them into these nice people, tipped all the time, just
make all the other drivers jealous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my claim to fame, and I enjoyed it. And so that's where I started, and I'd worked for several different companies. And finally in 2008, during the recession, which is probably not the best time to start, I actually went into working as a private chauffeur for the founders of Outback Steakhouse.
Okay.
And that lasted for about 7 years. But in the meantime, that's when I started my business, because, I just was like, well, I'll just start my own business. And really how I ended my career with them is because they didn't really like me having my own business. They felt like it was a conflict of interest. And I'm like, no, it's not. I've never once told you, no, I can't do it. Can't drive for you. So I left them, and that's kind of when my business took off. It was originally called Black Pearl Limousine because of the history of pirates in the Tampa Bay area. And I thought it was something that was unique. Come to find out, 19 other companies have that same name. So in fact, there's one in South Florida that I occasionally get their parking tickets. I've gotten sometimes their 1099s. So, it's too close. And so that's when one of the companies that I had purchased, because I'd purchased a couple companies. One of them was Walsh Airport Service.
Okay.
And it had been around since 95, started as an airport taxi service, had a lot of really good clients, Citigroup, JP Morgan, Bausch & Lomb. So it came with a lot of really good clients. And that's primarily what I was known with in the corporate stuff. So that's kind of where I went with it. And over time, because it was Walsh Airport Service, we kind of got pigeonholed into just doing airports. So when I started buying limos and that kind of stuff, people thought that all we did was just airport stuff. And I'm like, no, we do more. So that's during COVID, because I was operating 3 different websites, had 3 different marketing plans. I'm like,
Jeez.
Now's my chance. Everything's going into one. We're doing Walsh Chauffeured Transportation, one website, one phone number, streamline the whole thing. I know guys that are still using like multiple sites. I'm like, it's a waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money, effort. So that's when everything got kind of, put together. But yeah, so that's how I ended up where I'm at now.
Well, and it's really interesting because I hear a lot of talk right now about limo versus black car versus chauffeur versus bus versus motor coach. And
it's the same.
It is. And we're heading towards a point where, and I say this all the time, the ground transportation industry is what it's going to be, right? We're going to have taxi, limo, bus, shuttle, NEMT. I see everybody kind of being under one roof. But there's a lot to be said about the name, because like you said, if you've got a name that kind of ties you to one segment, that can hurt you to a certain extent. And so I find it really neat that you were able to get in there, kind of figure that out and keep that, because I see a lot of companies that struggle with that name. They're not sure what to do with it. They've got like 5 different variations of it. They're running different websites.
Well, and their mistake is the fact that they think that their actual name means something. And well, you know what I'm talking about. You're laughing because you know where I'm
I know
going
exactly
with this.
what you're talking about.
Because they think that means something. I'm like, no, you could call it Abracadabra Limo. It's not the name of your company. It's you.
Right.
They're doing business with you and the service that you provide. That's what they're coming back for. They could care less what it's called.
Look, naming something is, I'm a car guy at heart, right? I grew up loving cars, right? I'm a Mustang nut. I've still got the first Mustang I ever bought, my very first car sitting in the garage. But when it comes to naming stuff, I go back to this old story of Carroll Shelby is standing there with somebody and they said, hey, we got this new race Mustang. We got to come up with a name for it. What are we going to call it? And he goes, how far do you think it is from here to that barn? And they said, what? And say, how far it is do you think from here to that barn? I don't know, about 500 feet. No joke. That's why it's called a GT 500, because the guy thought it was about 500 feet. At the end of the day, right, just like in our business, people are buying it because it says Shelby on it and because they've learned to know that brand. Shelby didn't mean anything. It was just his name.
Another good story along that same line, because I worked for the founders of Outback Steakhouse, right? You want to know how they got the term Outback Steakhouse?
How?
They didn't know what to call it. And the movie Crocodile Dundee was big that year. So they said, we'll just call it Outback.
Yeah. No, and
it really meant nothing. And then once they started, they're like, oh, well, I guess we got to pick out some decor. I guess we'll go with Australian decor.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't know that one. And it's funny because, you've made a great point. A lot of this is understanding that your brand is about more than just a name, right? It's the experience you give your clients. It's the things you do for them. It's the way you make them feel, which makes me come back to something that you mentioned. And I'm fairly sure every single one of our listeners wants to know how you did it, right? You said you were taking those difficult clients and turning them into the best ones. What I want to know is, were you actually changing them, or is that something where you were able to figure out their needs? What were you doing? What was your magic there? What does everybody here need to know to make this work?
I think part of it is just you recognizing what people's needs are. You know, you
Yep.
kind of you see how they operate, what their expectations are, and it's a matter of figuring them out. The reason why most drivers couldn't do that is because they couldn't figure them out. But over time, I saw their tendencies. I saw what they liked. I saw what they didn't like. And so I was able to just kind of dial that in to where every time I saw them, I already knew what they liked. I knew what they didn't like. And so once they got to a point where they were comfortable and they knew that I knew what they liked, we kind of hit it off.
And it's funny because that's something we talk about a lot, right? You don't, obviously we're not in a room, but reading the room, figuring out exactly what that passenger wants, exactly what they need, and how to meet those needs.
And that's the hard part about this industry. And, we have a lot of people in and out of this business, but, it is an art form. It takes a certain type of person to be successful in this. And it's just being able to recognize those kind of things. It's just the customer service, understanding what people want and being able to read people. I've seen a lot of guys that think that, because you pick them up at this gigantic mansion that they should tip you an ungodly amount of money. And I'm like,
That's not how that works.
If you tailor your service depending on what size of house that they live in, you're going to be sadly mistaken. You have to give everybody the same level, the same great level of service, I should say. Because 9 times out of 10, it's the people. Because the guy that lives in the house, he's used to that service. So you're basically meeting his expectations. Okay.
Yep.
The people that don't do it very often, the birthday parties, the weddings, those are the ones that don't get treated the way we treat people. Taking their luggage, rolling out a red carpet, how we handle them, how we talk to them, how we make them feel special. Those are the ones that when they get done, they're like, hold on,
Yeah.
And you got to be able to read them, but also understand that it's not the people that you would think that tip you the most money.
When I was a kid, I worked at a car wash, and it was a great experience for me as a kid, right? Because you're getting cash, you're getting tips. But I was really lucky in that kind of all of my experiences growing up and working have somehow bled in, somehow helped, now that I'm president of PAX doing training, they all kind of had their own little thing they added. And the interesting thing that I found there is, you would have this beautiful, nice Mercedes come through, and the guy would give you like $2. You'd have an absolute beater, right? You'd clean it, you'd get it perfect. You might get $20. And then you might get a football player, right, that comes up all gaudy. He doesn't want to talk to you, doesn't want to do anything. And the next thing you know, he throws $100 in your hand, right? And the big thing there being is you never knew what you were going to get. You couldn't tell by the car. You couldn't tell by the person. But what I found is if you go and talk to some of these people, right, and obviously being a car wash kid, you didn't get a lot of time to talk. But it was a lot of times what we found is it really kind of wasn't something you could figure out. You're not going to be able to look at somebody and tell. You're not going to be able to, see them and know instantly whether or not you're going to get a tip. Yeah. But what we figured out as kids is if you just busted tail on every single one, at the end of the day, when you counted it out, it would even out. And you could tell this was a hard day's work. And yeah, there'd be days you'd bust your tails and they'd suck, but there'd be days that you didn't give it 100% and it would show up in your tips. So I think this industry has that same mentality.
Yeah. But that's also, you're busting your butt. It becomes normal. It doesn't seem like an effort because that's what you're used to doing.
Right.
My driver is always, I don't drive that much anymore, but when I do, I get tipped on every single run. And they're like, how do you do that? And I'm like, it's because I've done it for so long that it comes naturally. For them, they have to think about what they're doing. They have to think about the conversations that they're having. And I try and train them. I'm like, if all you're doing is holding the wheel and taking them from point A to point B, that doesn't deserve an extra tip. It doesn't, engage with them in conversation. Now, some people don't want to, but some people, and most people, are inquisitive and curious about the area they're at, what's going on locally. That's the experience part of it.
No, there's a huge difference, right? And I've talked about this on the podcast before. There's a huge difference between being ready and willing and providing the information and knowing when to do it, and then knowing when not to. And you've already nailed it, right? It's reading the room. If you've got, and I talked about it in another one of our episodes, one of my favorite trips ever is one when I didn't talk, right? And I love the sound of my own voice. I don't know when to shut up.
No.
But we're driving back from the airport, right? I was coming back from my very first ever limo show. This is maybe the second or third time I've ever ridden in a limo. And the guy looked in the rear view and he saw I was dead tired. And instead of, he reached for the radio. I'm like, oh God, he's going to turn up. He turns it down and he lets me kind of relax. That one stood out to me because he read the room. I probably would have had a conversation with him. I don't know that I would have had the energy, but he was reading the room. And, that is so important in what we do. Let me ask you, Tom. So you've done training, right? You've got tons of experience. You've come up, as a chauffeur. What are the tools you use when you're training somebody? How do you get these guys up to speed? How do you help them understand it? And more than just tips, right? For you now as an owner, those tips, that experience, that really translates to repeat customers that only want to use your company. So how do you train these guys? What does that look like? What's your formula there?
Well, I used to train them myself because I had a lot of experience. Okay. And what I realized is they weren't getting consistent training. So, and shameless plug, I started using the PAX training system. And yours was consistent. It's measurable. It was, and when my drivers went through it, they're like, but we already knew this. They're like, this is all the stuff you taught us.
Right.
And I'm like, yes, but now I know that you've completed this module and this module. So I know what you've done. When I train people, it's like anything, if you're doing, storytelling time, every time you tell it, it's going to be different,
right?
And you don't want those inconsistent messages. You want them to have consistent training. And so everybody gets the same message, everybody gets the same methods, all that kind of stuff. And it's been done. Because sometimes, and when I train, because to me, I think there's a lot of training that goes into this business.
Right.
So I would only train them on things that they were experiencing at the time, because really it doesn't make sense until you actually experience it. Right.
Right.
Like if you're doing a plain side pickup, well, if you've never done that, why would I tell you about it? So before you do that, I go, okay, this is what you're going to do. This is how you do it. So when they go and they do it, it clicks and everything makes sense. And they go, oh, okay, now I know how to do that.
Right.
But your system, you get to see it visually and hear it. So, I think that makes more sense, because I can't replicate that when I'm training people. I have to wait for it to happen.
And let me ask you something. One of the things that has always been huge for me is the shift from a trainer to a coach, right? And that's probably one of the biggest things that we've always strived to give operators or the trainer, whoever's using PAX, is to shift them from being a trainer to a coach. Because if I take you to an airport and I show you the airport and I tell you all about it, and then we leave, I'm not in the position of, okay, here, I want you to, we'll use an FBO, for example. I want you to take this module on the FBO. You're going to see how it's done. You're going to do everything. I'm going to drive over to the FBO. I now want you to walk me through what you do, right? Now I'm coaching you. I'm not trying to tell you. Have you seen that shift in yourself or using that? Have you been able to kind of make that pivot?
Well, when you said between a trainer and a coach, the thing I was envisioning for a coach is reinforcing those things that they've learned and kind of being more of, for lack of a better term, like a cheerleader. Like, they know those things and I know they know those things, but when they do a good job and a customer recognizes them for that, make sure you pass it along,
Amen.
Make sure you thank them for the work that they did that day. Make sure that, you show appreciation to them. So, because everybody wants to be appreciated, and it just develops a better relationship and it reinforces all the things that they've learned,
Oh, absolutely. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. We're a firefighting industry, right? As owners, a lot of time is spent on what is most on fire right now and how do I get those flames to die down.
Every day.
Second I've got this thing under control, it's like, oh, look, new flames are bursting out over here. Mm-hmm. And so you really have to make it a point to do that. You have to give that praise, because if you're running a squeaky wheel company, you're not going to get to where you need to be, right? You're not going to have them really kind of motivated. So is there a certain thing that you found that is kind of like your key to success, or kind of what, obviously coming up through that, you've got so many different things to pick from it, but is there something specifically where you can point to and say, I wish I would have done that sooner. I wish I would have figured that out sooner.
I wish I would have gotten involved with the NLA sooner and going to the shows. I mean, it wasn't until, believe it or not, I mean, I know a lot of people know who I am in this industry, but I've really worked on my brand and made myself available and made myself part of conversations. But I really didn't get involved in this until 2017. I was not a member. I did not attend shows, but I wish I would have gotten involved sooner, because I thought because I was a chauffeur that I knew the business inside and out. And even though I have a college degree with a business background and everything like that, things had changed. Okay. Between the time I graduated in 96 till, 2008, when I started my own company. So I was running it, but I was running it based on the knowledge I had as a chauffeur, which is not business, which is not business knowledge. It's customer service knowledge. And I nailed that. Okay. Huh. But the accounting, the marketing, the finance, all that, I kind of lost touch with all that stuff. So I was running my company and I was just kind of at this plateau, and I'm like, why am I not getting to the next level? Why am I just right here? I need to get up here.
Right.
How do I do that? And it wasn't until I started going to the shows and going to those sessions and getting those little nuggets of knowledge that I would bring back that things started going up, and that's really what I wish I would have done it sooner.
So you said 2017 is when you joined the NLA. 2008 is when you make the leap, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking roughly 9 years, if I did the math right. So what do you think you would have been able to do with those 9 years if you would have made that leap earlier, if you would have gone and found that? Because it sounds like you were kind of just operating, and we call it kind of operating as an island, right? You kind of had your knowledge, you kind of had what you're doing, you're operating as an island. What do you think would have changed, or what do you think you could have done different with those 9 years, or the growth there?
I probably would have been farther along, I probably, because those were good years, because I started during the recession. So obviously coming out of the recession, those were great years. And even though they were great years, I was just kind of stagnating because of the stuff I didn't know. So I probably would have been farther along. I probably would have a larger company. I wouldn't have been struggling, that's for sure. And not that I was struggling financially, I was struggling to reach my goals.
I will tell you, I have friends in this industry that are one-car operators. I have, friends in this industry that are, 200, people on their staff, huge companies. And the one thing that I have seen, and even with, the mentors that I have in the industry, is a lot of it also comes down to kind of personal growth and being able to get to a next level. And I can tell you, one of the things that Brett Barinholtz talked a lot about was mentorship. And yes. I think that's something you're kind of alluding to here, is that having those people that have gone down those roads and having them help you is huge. So, one of the neat things, though, is you've actually taken that even further, because now you're on the membership committee for the NLA, right?
Right.
So, I guess let me ask you, if you've got someone listening and they're saying, hey, I'm not where I want to be in my business, I might be an association, I might not be. What can they start doing that you were able to figure out and do that's going to help them?
Well, there's a lot to be said for finding somebody that's in a level where you want to be and figuring out what they do, whether either directly or indirectly. Say, hey, how did you get to where you're at? Can you help me? It's finding those mentors, because sometimes you don't have to build the bridge. Sometimes you just need somebody to hand you the instructions,
right. Point to it over there, right? Just right. You're walking the wrong direction.
Yeah. And here's the pitfalls. Here's the mistakes I made. Don't do this. Okay.
Right.
Because it is, there's either mentors or, there's peer groups. I mean, there's several peer groups I'm involved in, and we talk regularly. There's still pitfalls that we have. There's still issues that we have. And we kind of figure them out. Everybody goes, okay, that's a great idea. I think I'm going to do that. This worked for me. This didn't work. But when you're an island and you don't know anything, and you don't know where to reach out, it's a lonely place.
I can tell you, I think one of the things that I learned early on is that it's really easy to see a problem, solve a problem, see a problem, solve a problem. And sometimes, especially on the bigger problems, you will spend all this time figuring out how to build that bridge. And, you might talk to someone that's been in the industry and they might go, oh, well, you could have crossed the one over there and been done with it. I've been guilty of that. I know my mentor's been guilty of that. And I'm a very type A personality. So I'm notorious for doing stuff like that.
Right.
So
I think we all are. I mean, we all think that we're, the only one that can solve our problems, and that's not always the case.
no, it's not. Well, and let me ask you, you also, you're also really involved in a state level, right? Because you're
Right.
part of the membership committee, which, we're going to keep saying it again and again and again. You guys had a massive win in Florida with being able to get your legislation passed for your permitting.
Right.
What would you say, what's the difference between the NLA and the state? I hear people say, well, I'm part of the state association. I don't know to be part of the NLA, or I'm part of the NLA, so I don't do anything at the state level. Clearly, you're really active in both. What's kind of the differences between the two, and what's the benefit you get from each?
The differences between both of them, the NLA is something where you get a lot of really good business knowledge. The connections that you make in other parts of the country, those are the folks that you can talk with that give you, unfiltered advice. Okay. Because they don't operate in the same market as you. There's no silver bullet as to, how to operate in your market. You're not talking with your direct competitors. Right. So the flow of information is much more freer. And when you're talking about a local association, yes, you're competitors, but you operate in the same market. So when you put your voice together, you can get things done like we did with the reciprocity bill, because that was something that had been tried, and we've been working on that for probably decades. And when you work on local issues, you need local people to work on that stuff. It's not something that the NLA could do, and they can't work on every state, every city. Right. It's just not possible. It's not financially possible. It's not physically possible. So in your local one, that's where you handle all that. That's where you want to create your level playing field for everybody. Yes, you can be competitors, but everybody still needs to operate on a reasonable and level playing field. So in the state of Florida, when they first started, or not started as a state, but originally there was very few people that lived in Florida. So what the state did was gave a lot of responsibilities to the counties. Okay, there's 67 counties in the state of Florida. Because the population is growing, and because of technology, and because of where we're at as a society, we connect more. Okay, so a lot of the local jurisdictions, the state needs to take over, so there's more uniformity. Okay, yep. So as the population grows, the state is taking back a lot of this, the legislation, the oversight for a lot of those things, and they needed to take it over for the transportation industry. The problem was it was still handled county to county. Okay, so there was a lot of conflicting rules, conflicting permitting processes, duplicate processes. For companies that were down in the South Florida area, they would have to have 11 different permits on their cars. They had to get permitted for 3 different airports, 2 different cruise ports. Drivers would have to get like 3 different background checks every year at their own expense. It was redundant. It was very redundant. So when we, put the regional associations together into the one FLA, that's when we really found our voice. We were able to hire lobbyists. Randy down in Fort Myers had a connection with one of the legislatures who sponsored our bill. And that's really where it got started. Because they had always promised, that they were going to get to us. When Uber came in, I went to a lot of those workshops and meetings, and I dealt with a lot of the county issues, and they kept going, we got to deal with them right now because this is popular.
Did any of that apply to them? Did any of the permitting, right? Did they have to have the window stickers, or did they just kind of skate through all of it?
They skated through all of that.
Yeah.
They basically wrote their own legislation. They did whatever they want. And face it, they had a lot of money to do that.
Right. They greased the wheels with cash.
Yeah, but when they got done, it never got back to us. Okay. So that's what we did. We kind of forced the issue, and everybody agreed they needed to take care of it. And so we finally got, did the right things and got the right people in place, got it done. And so that's what we had passed last year. There's still a little bit of foot dragging and delaying because the counties, the ones that had their own permits had their own inspectors. They had their own infrastructure of people that they employed to write tickets, to do inspections, to do all. They don't want to give those people up. So, you go, look, you've got to do this now. And they're like, well, that's not the way we see it. So there's still, our attorney has to deal with them going, yeah, this is the way the bill's written. This is what you need to do. And we're still in that process because, we're to the point now where some of the companies down there have to keep the actual law in their glove box. So when one of the inspectors says, hey, you're violating this, he'd go, here's the law that says that I'm permitted in this county and you're supposed to recognize it.
We've seen that happen. There's a couple things worth mentioning, right? So obviously being in training, when they did the entry level driver training requirement for new CDL drivers, we saw a lot of similar things. And that in that world, more so than getting rid of people, it was getting people to understand it. So one of the things that the entry level driver training requirement has is if you get a Class B for the first time, you upgrade from B to an A, you get an A, or you do a school bus, a passenger, or a hazmat, you have to go through and you have to do entry-level driver training. But things like getting an air brake restriction removed, things like that, you don't have to do entry-level driver training for. And I would have customers of ours that would say, hey, I got to get this guy's air brake removed. And I'd say, great, just take him to the DMV, take the vehicle and do it. And the DMVs would say, well, no, you have to do entry-level driver training. And so it got to the point where they had to do the same thing, right? They had to go in and say, hey, we get you're trying to follow a federal law, but read this pamphlet from FMCSA that says when it applies, and just be aware this is not a time it applies. And I think the other side of that, and this is something that we've seen in our industry before, is we also become a source of revenue, right? They are getting revenue from us in terms of permits. You see the fights happening with congestion pricing in New York. You see things like that. These are revenue generators for the county, for the state, for the airport, for the city, for whoever's putting that in.
We've moved past safety to the traveling public and gone into direct revenue generating.
Yeah. And it, you kind of seen the same thing happen, right? You see, speeding tickets or DUI checkpoints, you see these things. Yeah, they serve a good purpose to society, but at certain points in times, there's also an argument to be made of, if it's not done in service of the public, in service of safety, then at that point it becomes revenue generation. And as we've kind of seen with some of these industry disruptors, TNCs and whatnot, sometimes they're able to use money to grease the wheels to not have to kind of get it paid one piece at a time. They're able to come in and get sweeping legislation and write one big check.
Right.
So let me ask you, what, it sounds like I already know the answer of, was it worth it for you guys? I feel like the answer is yes. You are making progress.
Yeah, we're definitely making progress.
One of the things I hear, especially with the little guys, is I don't have time to be involved in that. That's bigger than me. The bigger guys are going to take care of it. It's going to get done. I'm too small for it to matter. I'm too early on in the business. Yeah. You hear all those little island mentality things.
Well, you can't see the forest for the trees kind of mentality.
Yes. So I guess what would you say to that person, right? Obviously, for you, it's been huge. Being involved in these associations is a big part of getting where you're getting. What would you say to that person that's still got that mentality? They're
probably not going to see it until they run into a problem like what I did. Like
until you hit the tree.
Growing, you hit the wall. You're like, what am I missing?
Right.
And some people will never get it. They'll drop out of the business, or they'll just stay at the level they're at. And some people will be like, there's got to be more. I've got to find the answer. And then they'll get to that next level. On the local level, we're trying to reach them and explain to them the benefits of being, a part of the NLA or the FLA. A lot of it is what we're trying to do is do more social media stuff to where there's more engagement, because we're such a large state. Yeah. We can only get together like twice a year. So, we need to create more value for people to become members and show them, here's the value of being a part of this. So we need to get more engagement. And I think, we're all on our phones. We're all connected through social media. So I think doing that reaches those people they're in their cars, they're waiting in the cell phone lot, they're waiting outside of a restaurant for a client. Well, they can engage right from there,
Yeah.
you know? So that's one of the things that I've been working on developing is having those mechanisms to discuss business things all the time, and hoping that, somebody will be like, wow, I learned something. I didn't know that. I'm going to use that, and then they start getting it and they start,
Right.
because let's face it, rising tide raises all boats, and that's what we
Yep.
want to do, because it's the people who don't know what they're doing that's given our industry kind of a bad look. There are people who are confused between us and the TNCs.
Right. And I think you've hit on something that's really important, right? And that's the rising tide lifts all boats. I think we are at a point in the industry where anybody that's got a scarcity mentality is at a disadvantage, because I think when I first got into the industry, I remember, and Bruce has told this story on the podcast before, right? We had a guy come to our booth. I got 75 idiots, right? How can you fix them? And we were in shock. And the size of the industry, the shape of the industry, the look of the industry has changed. And we're at a point right now where the industry is stronger working together. Yeah, you might have some overlap in business. Yeah, I might take some of your business. You might take some of mine. But overall, what we're seeing is in the markets where, and obviously, there's rules to be followed. But in the markets where the companies are getting together and they're saying, hey, I've got overflow at this time. You've got overflow at that time, right? I'm going to need affiliate. You're going to need affiliate. You have vehicles that, you have available that I don't have. In those markets where they're working together, they're able to do a couple things. The first is they've got a really tight grip on quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they knew who they're using. Nothing, and we talked about this with another association recently. One of the things that absolutely just crushes my soul is when I see someone get on Facebook and just blindly, who's here, and they take the first option.
Yeah.
There's no vetting. There's no nothing. Now, hey, I'm all for connecting. I'm all for getting online. I'm all for finding new people. But I can't tell you how many times you'll see someone get on and go, hey, I need something in 2 hours in this place. And the very first person that comments is getting the work. If you think about that from the side of your client, I don't care if it's a motor coach. I don't care if it's an SUV. I don't care what it is. If we get there, right, and it's a complete train wreck, ultimately, we're not going to be mad at the affiliate because we trusted you to take care of us.
Right.
And so I think that's something that I see a lot. And that
I would hope that they're not doing that like the first answer. I would hope they're doing a little bit more vetting. I mean, I know I do. Sometimes it's easier to post and get responses than it is to start making 50 phone calls. And I look at who's recommending who, and have I heard of that company or that ownership before, because sometimes, and this happens a lot. I mean, we're all connected on Facebook by the owner's name. I don't even know half the company names that they even own. So I don't even know what city they're in sometimes, but, oh yeah, I know this guy. I've heard of him. Oh yeah. Okay. So sometimes it's just a quicker way to get a response, especially if you're looking something within a couple hours, because let's face it, it could take you a while to make phone calls for that.
No, absolutely. And I think part of that, and this is something that we talked a lot about when I was talking with that other association, was, having a process to vet them. PAX training, if you go on to our website, you go under resources, there's a company directory. You can see point blank, are they an active PAX training member, right? You can do the same thing in the NLA's directory, right? You can do the same thing across various different methods to try and vet them. Now, is that going to be, better or worse than, all of the other methods out there? It depends on what you're trying to figure out, but you've got to decide what that process looks like, and you've got to have it in place.
That's part of that cross-reference vetting, though, too. I mean, yes, somebody's going to give you a name and a number, on social media, but, you should be going to those places to double check if they're a member. Are they PAX trained? Are they doing this? Those kind of things. What software are they using? All those things are great.
Well, and I think there's something to be said also about the relationships that you build, right? I think knowing, because one of the things that I see online a lot as well is when something goes wrong, the way that owner at that company is going to handle it is completely different. And especially if you have someone, you have a relationship, you have someone, you know, they're going to do whatever it takes to make it right. That's completely different than if you've got someone that you've done minimal vetting, right? You don't know anything about them. If I know that even if something does go wrong, you're going to bend over backwards in your market to take care of it.
Yes.
That's what becomes a huge deal. And I'm sure that's something that was important to you guys, having started kind of in that world. And obviously, I don't want you to throw yourself under a bus, but was there ever a time when you were kind of early on and you guys were that, you know, in that place getting that work where you guys were able to go above and beyond, or maybe you had to jump in and do something and it turned a corner or turned the tide for you?
There was a lot of times that, you know, you would do something you'd never done before and it worked out. And then there was some times that didn't quite work out. And, you know, you knew you were in over your head. But it's nice to have those relationships to be able to reach out and go, hey, I'm having a problem. You know, can you help me? You know, and having those relationships with the other people that you're working with, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's all about the customer and it's all about the result. It's not about how you got there, you know.
Right.
So if you're having difficulties, let somebody know about it, you know, because you may not be able to solve the problem, but they may be able to fix the problem on their end, you know. So it's having that collaboration with the people you're getting the work from, you know, that really helps. And being honest.
That's probably one of the biggest things when I talk to people about things that go wrong with affiliates. A lot of times the lack of honesty and transparency, you know, and it's really funny, you know, Brett Barenholtz said, you know, all I care about with my affiliates, I'm not worried about price. Don't screw up my client, right? And if something goes wrong, you call me, you tell me, we start fixing it now. I don't want to find out later, right? I think that to me is huge because we're in a logistics industry. You got to have the right guy in the right car at the right place, at the right time, saying the right thing, doing the right thing. And it doesn't always work out. And so I think
and we all know things are going to happen.
Yes.
You know, and it's not, you know, I always tell people, I'm like, when you have a service failure, it's not usually one thing that happens. It's usually 2, 3, or 4 things in a row that happen
cascade
that you couldn't possibly predict that's what screws it up. You can only hope that you have a good enough relationship with that client to seek forgiveness, you know?
Well, and I think that goes back, and I feel like kind of our theme here is join your association, right? Because a lot of that goes back to, if you're parts of these associations, if you spent the time with these, you know, operators, if you built those relationships, it's a completely different experience when you know the person on the other side of the phone, right? When you've spent time with them, when you've had lunch or dinner or whatever it might be with them, there's a much bigger attachment than somebody with a random account that came to them through the internet.
Yes. But on the other side, there's also the drivers. And if they're not properly trained or they're not using packs, you know, they should be also communicating with their office or whoever that, you know, either things are on track or things are off track, and you need to know about it because I'm behind schedule. You know, an accident happened. I'm stuck on a bridge, you know, any number of those things, because if they're not honest with you, you can't really fix the problem. And they're the ones on the front line.
And there's 2 parts to that, right? When we talk about that, you know, because we do dispatcher, we do CSR training, right? As the chauffeur, 2 things. As an owner, you can't make an environment where they're scared. If they're scared to tell you something's gone wrong, they're not going to tell you, and it's going to make more things go wrong. So as an owner, as an operator, you've got to have an environment where if something goes wrong, you understand and you give them a little bit of grace. That chauffeur's got to understand that if something's going wrong, if they see something, they need to be proactive and they need to get ahead of it. And then as a dispatcher, your dispatchers have got to be watching that board, right? If they see, hey, this is running over, this turned into an as directed, you know, something's happened. I know there's no way that, you know, my chauffeur in 53, it can't possibly get across town to get to the next pickup. That dispatcher, whether or not that chauffeur's called, whether or not they've even figured it out, if you as the dispatcher don't figure that out and rework it, or if you as the owner don't have dispatchers that figure it out and rework it, that's where you start getting those cascading failures that you've talked about. And having a team that has that little bit of proactivity and foresight is huge. And I talk about all the time, training is proactive. If you're not proactively training and teaching and developing people, and like you said earlier, ongoing, being a coach, that's where you start to see those types of failures.
But, and also too, it's not just the, as it's happening kind of coordination, it's the pre-trip planning too,
Yeah.
because somebody should be doing a schedule that gives the driver a chance to make things happen. If you're not leaving enough time in between, if you're not leaving enough time for a flight to be late or accounting for traffic, the driver can't possibly be successful if the schedule's not done right. Now things will happen, but and that's where there's a little bit of experience that goes into that, trip planning stuff, but the driver should also be looking at it too. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I've done schedules and I'm like, yeah, that should work. And then the driver calls me up and he's done a little trip planning. He goes, I looked this up and I'm not so sure. And I've had to go, I think you're right. But there's that conversation that needs to happen, and that pre-trip planning, I think a lot of people don't even do anymore.
No, and it's funny because now we've hit my home territory, right? Now we're hitting me where I live. We got to be careful, or we'll end up recording a whole nother second part of this episode, make this a 2-hour episode. But it absolutely comes down to that, because you've got to think about every link in the chain. If it breaks, the whole chain falls, right? And so as that driver, as that chauffeur, right, whoever you call them, whatever you've got that set up, as they plan their day out, they need to be looking at the routes. They need to be looking at what's going on.
And the next job, and the next job.
Yeah. And then same thing with the dispatcher. The night before, when the dispatcher was planning that out, they've got to do it. And, especially if you deal with airports, one of the interesting things about our industry is it doesn't matter if the flight's delayed 20 minutes or 2 hours. Most passengers are still going to expect you to be out there waiting for them. Why? Because they don't care about any other trip you're doing. It doesn't matter if it's a bus and there's 50 people coming, or if it's a car and it's just one person. They assume they're your only passenger. They assume no one else matters but them.
And that's the problem I have when you hire TNC drivers, is because they have that taxi mentality. The only thing they care about is the job that they're on. And when it's done, they're like, okay, what's next? I'm like, you're in the limousine business. You're not only doing this job, you're monitoring the next job and the traffic to get to the next job and the flight for that next job.
Right.
There's a lot going on. And if you're not trained properly, you're not setting yourself up or the company up to be successful either. You should be looking ahead.
I think one of the big things there, I grew up as a Boy Scout, right? I had be prepared beat into me. I travel. I've literally got a small umbrella in my backpack. Why? Because I know that if I'm in Florida, it's going to rain. And if I'm in California, where it never rains in Southern California, the one day I'm there, it'll rain to remind me, be prepared. I think
I'm probably the only one. I store emergency ponchos in the glove box.
but a lot of that's foresight, right? And I can tell you one of my favorite limo stories was, we had an operator that was doing a funeral, and during the funeral, it started raining, and, the chauffeurs were over by the vehicles, right? All of the transportation was over there, and, the owner happened to be there on this one. He said, guys, grab the umbrellas. Everybody grab an umbrella. I don't want a single head over there getting red. And everybody grabs the umbrellas and they run over and they do it. Look, they could have just gotten the vehicle and not got wet, but they understood that, hey, their preparation and taking care of those people on that day is going to gain them a client for life.
100%. Done that exact situation. Yep.
So as we kind of wrap up, I kind of want to ask you what, and obviously we've talked about associations, but if there was one thing you could go back, right? And you can tell me at what point you go back to, right? Whether it's when you're driving, the guys that started Outback, whether it's when you first started driving, but if you could, hop in the DeLorean, right? Back to the future and go back in time, catch yourself and say, hey, here's your Ray's Almanac, right? Here's your secret that you need to know. What would you go tell yourself?
I probably would say just to get involved earlier, much sooner than I did. That's really about it. I love the industry. I don't know that I would go back and say, hey, don't do that. Because I've realized there's a certain personality and we all have it. We all like to, have our hair on fire. You don't know what's going next. I always tell people, I'm like, there's no way I could sit in a cubicle and do the same thing every day from 9 to 5. I would kill myself. I love the randomness of it. I love, you never know what's going to happen. The stressful situations, the resolution of certain events, the fact that you have a beginning, middle, and an end. Like some people, their job, they do the same thing month after month, year after year. There's no beginning, there's no end. I'm like, there's nothing to be satisfied about. With me, with this business, it's like everything has a story. Everything has a beginning, middle, and end, whether it's a convention, a wedding, an airport trip. There's always a beginning and a middle and an end. And getting to the end is so satisfying, especially when it's successful and the people like love it and they write good reviews about you and, all that stuff. That's satisfying. I can't imagine working in an office where, you get your employee review every 6 months and they go, yep, great job. See you then 6 months later. I love that daily, affirmation, for lack of a better term, that things were successful. It's intoxicating.
I think for me, I relate to that completely. I don't know that I could do the cubicle ever again. Once I got that small business bug, once you're solving problems, you're constantly growing. For me, at least, one of the biggest things is I always loved Jim Rohn. And one of his famous quotes is, "It's not what you're getting, it's what you're becoming." And I can tell you, if I'd spent that, and I've been in the industry almost 10 years, right? Not even holding a candle to you yet. I'm just trying to be like you, Tom. But, almost
It'll
10
happen
years
before you know it.
For me, though, it was, I don't think I would have grown that much as a person if I'd been sitting in a cubicle. I think being involved in the industry, having a business has helped me grow. And it sounds like you're kind of in that same boat.
Yeah. And people that don't own businesses have no idea what we go through.
Oh, no. I've mentioned it before. My father-in-law loves to say that, he started his business in his basement. He had, practically nothing. At one point, he was living in a corner of his business, and people will come up to him now and they go, "Oh, you're an overnight success." And he goes, "Yeah, but you didn't get to see how long the night was,
Yeah.
You didn't get to see the 15, 20, 30 years of hitting my head on the wall, wondering whether or not this is a good choice."
Yeah. There's a lot of entrepreneurial, and mentors that say, yeah, everybody remembers your success, but they never remember how many times you failed to get to that success.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, obviously I'm lucky enough to call you one of my friends, so we could do this all day. I can't thank you enough for coming on. Obviously,
thank you for having me.
I think we'll have to do another call. I think
I was just going to say, I'd love to do it again.
Yeah, no, I would love to have you on for another episode. I know that obviously, you and I get to do all kinds of cool stuff together. Maybe we can do a live episode somewhere at one of the association events. Thank you to everybody for listening. Again, I've got, Tom Halsnik over at Walsh Chauffeured Transportation in Tampa with me. So I'm super excited to have him. Man, anything else you want to leave us with before we check out?
I would just say, get involved. If you're passionate about your industry, then be passionate about it. Don't just be your own island. You're never gonna be successful if you're your own island. Get involved with the rest of the group. You're gonna love it.
And subscribe to the podcast.
And subscribe to the podcast. Click the link above here, or down here,
down below, around. No, absolutely. I think that's probably the most solid advice we could end with is get off your island.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We hope you'll join us again on the Ground Transportation Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Ground Transportation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about PAX Training and to contact James, go to paxtraining.com. And for more information about driving transactions and to contact Ken, go to drivingtransactions.com. We'll see you next time on the Ground Transportation Podcast.